but you actually took it very far from like this inspirational paper that you read and towards now, right? So because a lot of your research is related to actually social touch, right? Like social interactions and how haptics can enable it in remote relationship or any other settings, which we'll talk about, which maybe we can even jump into now and basically open up this topic of social touch, right? And I was wondering, like reading your some of your papers on social touch and also your talks on social touch. And we also know, like as you haptician, you design some prototypes, right? Obviously, you know there are certain limitations, right, to technology, haptic technology, actuation technology, but also to the actual sense of touch, right? So our perception of touch is also, and how much information can we actually, take using our skin receptors, right, is also limited. So considering these kind of limitations or maybe peculiarities, let's call it, what elements of social touch do you think should be or can be reproduced by haptic technology?
Yeah. So I think the sort of paradoxical nature of mediated social touch or creating social touch experiences where people may be at different places in the world, I think is actually what got me interested in the topic to begin with. There's a sort of strangeness to trying to do that because, of course, in naturalistic settings, when people are face to face, touch happens very sort of naturally in the sense that you don't perhaps think about it too much. It's part of a larger interactive process where facial expressions play a role. The context in which this touch takes place plays a role. I think these are all insights that, as a field focusing on this niche of social touch, we've gotten more interested in and more sensitive to over the years. But those, I think, were some of the challenges that originally drew me into the topic. And so I think at first what a lot of my research was aimed at, and I think this is also something that the field really from the get-go tried to get right, is what are the sort of types of sensations that we can create using haptic technologies. So really focusing on what it feels like. And can we get close to some aspects of how social touch feels through the use of technology? So from my own work, a very concrete example is we've been quite inspired as a part of our research group back then by research into CT afferent nerve fibers. So this neuroscience research that shows this sort of dedicated pathway for affective and social touches with
basically
receptors.
Pleasant touch, right? It's kind of
exactly, yeah. So basically, that's pleasant touch, and that's sort of operationalized as this slow stroking touch, to which these CT afferents also respond most vigorously and align very well with subjective ratings of pleasantness. And so this idea was very inspirational for us to see, okay, if this is sort of a type of touch that signals about social relevance, is that a type of touch that we can somehow reproduce through available technologies? And in our case, this was a very simple type of interface, an array of vibration motors where we use a specific technique to activate these motors independently and to make sure that you feel a sort of illusory vibrotactile point move over the skin. Then we could manipulate the velocity at which this point moved over the skin. So also encode in that way sort of movement information, which is very relevant to these type of affective touches. So that was one area that was very inspirational and an interesting type of touch to look into in trying to mediate that through technology.
And how do you think, how large is the gap between the real sensation, let's say, of a stroking gesture or pleasant touch, let's call it generically, right, and the mediated touch that is trying to simulate it in terms of perception and user experience?
Yeah, I think in this particular case, very large, I would say. So this is a relatively crude implementation that we had with ERMs, eccentric rotating mass vibration motors. So not even the more accurate voice coil type actuators. So in that sense, it was quite far removed. But the interesting thing is we did find some indications that at least this motion information, so the velocity of movement, seemed to influence people's ratings of pleasantness, similar to how that works in actual touch. So I think that's part of my work, is also looking at to what extent can we remove all kinds of things that are present in naturalistic social touch settings, and translate that to very simple technological interactions and see if some of the experience of touch still remains.
But then there is also kind of an element of the context, right? And people who are senders and receivers of that mediated touch, right? That probably affects a lot, right? Even if we reach the point of 100% simulation, that's, let's say, as pleasant as it gets, as pleasant as the real touch, then how does the meaning how do you convey the meaning for it, right? Like,
yeah,
how do you go about that, considering the context, people? Have you investigated how the meaning is interpreted?
Yeah, so this is actually a topic that I'm focusing on more recently. So my thinking has moved away a little bit from trying to, find ways of reproducing physical aspects of touch per se. So there are other people doing fantastic work there. But what I think the field is really missing is this idea of how does touch actually unfold in an interaction between people in a naturalistic setting, but also when it is mediated through technologies. And so one of my recent papers sort of addresses that issue from a specific theoretical perspective, where I use 4E cognition theories to argue that, we should be looking more into these interactive processes, so the reciprocity of touch. And the point I try to make there is that meaning of touch is actually something that is almost negotiated within the actual interaction, which happens always in a particular context, right? And I think that process of how two people actually create meaning through an interaction, through a technological interaction, I think that's a very fascinating topic. So one example of work that we recently did is we gave people a set of bracelets that they could use to touch each other over distance. So these were app connected. And we basically let them use it for 2 weeks without too many restrictions. And what we wanted to see is how do people sort of integrate these kinds of technologies into their day-to-day communication practices, which of course also feature use of messaging applications and things like that, and seeing what kind of meaning do they attribute to these types of touches within the interaction in that diet.
Can you share results, or they're not ready yet?
Yeah, so I'll have to do this a little bit off the top of my head. So one of the things
just the general, because we don't have that much time, but it would be nice, like the highlights probably.
Yeah, so one thing that was very clear is, these bracelets that we used were not something that worked perfectly. So there was really this element of people trying to work around issues that they experience with the technology. And I'm mentioning that because I think that sort of shows that people are aware that they are in an experiment, right? They are aware that they are part of a study, which is the context of use in that case. And so they make extra effort to make it work. So I think if this was something that you maybe buy, it would not be something that you would be so forgiving towards. So I think that's already an element of how context plays a role. And I think that the main finding is that for people, this was sort of a very low effort way to let the other person know, I'm thinking about you. That's sort of across the board the most mentioned meaning that people assign to this touch. And interestingly, there was also this aspect of reciprocity, which was very present in the data. So participants sort of expected, once they send a touch to another person, to receive one back within a certain time frame. And if they wouldn't receive one back, they would start calling or texting to ask about, hey, where's the touch? Where's the touch back that I'm receiving?
So they got hooked very quickly.
They got hooked in a way, yeah. I think it's also shaping expectations, and I think that's something you only really find out when you give people this technology to actually use within a context, and seeing how these patterns emerge as they interact with this or through this technology. Yeah,
this is very exciting because indeed there is a research gap in terms of like context, right? So we kind of know ways of reproducing. Yeah, they could be better, but there is enough already kind of base. But we don't know much about very specific contexts of use of touch, of mediated touch.
And I think there's a lot of work that says context is important, and I've probably said it somewhere as well. But I'm beginning to doubt how meaningful is saying that, right? Because what is context? How do we define context? And it's more important to think about how context is important rather than stating that it is important, because context can be an infinite number of variables.
Exactly. And then also the question, we can design for all the context out there, right? So probably we also need to be able somewhat kind of categorize context, right, in larger groups, and then see how this unfolds in terms of mediated touch, right?
Yeah, and I think also that to pick up on that, I think the approach we had in this particular study, and one that I'm quite sympathetic to, is that what we try to do with these kinds of technologies is also somehow give people tools that they can then use in whatever way they see fit. So for these bracelets, I've also used them. And one thing that I did was taking public transport, I would touch it to signal, hey, the train arrived and I'll be home in 10 minutes. That was kind of a sort of message that was encoded, not literally in a Morse code type session, but encoded in the sense that it was at a certain time, at a certain moment. And so I think these kinds of patterns that really sort of emerge when you give people this technology, and they can shape the use and they can define the context. To me, that's a very interesting approach in coming to grips what contextual factors matter for the people that use the technology.
So basically you want to say, and it's already like a topic of not only social touch, actually, it's about the haptic language, right? Which is a huge area of design, a challenging area for haptics in general, haptic language. How do you design it? So what you want to say, it's probably enough to have for specific areas, I mean, limited, but still, like, it's enough to have one pattern that can be given to people, and people will define how they use this pattern in different contexts, right? So we don't need to design all kinds of different vibrotactile or other types of actuation patterns to mean something separately. We can only have like a couple of them, and then people can use it as they please. Is that something you are hitting at?
I think so. I think at least in part. So I think people can assign meaning to relatively simple types of interactions. I mean, that's also what you see with use of emoji and the type of language that's used in text messaging. But that is not to say that sort of the affordances of the technology don't change the type of interactions and the type of meanings that people can assign to these interactions. So I think through this kind of a bracelet, you will have a different kind of meaning being created in the interaction compared to language, for example, right, which is much richer than this one-dimensional signal. So I think there's definitely a design space to think about how can we create these kinds of tools, and what do the tools allow people to do as part of a mediated social touch interaction. So I think that's an interesting process to think about. What do we put into the technology, and then how is it used and reshaped and contextualized by people? That is an interesting trajectory for research, in my opinion.
Right. So it requires some kind of a lot of studies in situ, right, in the field, basically, which we lack also.
I think so, yeah.